They said Quillen Voss was digging a grave and calling it a home. In Red Hollow, that was the kind of sentence that stuck. It passed from porch to porch, from wagon seat to feed counter, until it hardened into judgment. Men said he would come crawling out before New Year's, begging for a real stove. Women said the cold would take the children first. And Lorne Bellamy, an old freight hauler who had seen wagons vanish in white storms and had left 2 fingers to winter, said it plain. If Quillen kept putting his hope into that hole, Elsie, Bram, and little June would stiffen before the month was out. That was the charge against him. A young man, 3 children, a pit in the ground, no proper house, no proper fuel, no proper sense. And the winter of 1885 was already gathering itself over the high plains. By late December, the wind had begun to shift in the way old-timers feared most. It turned sharp, then still, then strange. In that country, a warm hour could lie. A quiet sky could set a trap. Temperature could fall nearly 50 degrees in less than half a day. And when it did, every board wall, every stovepipe, every loose door seam would be judged without mercy. On the surface, people trusted wood, iron, and what had worked before. Below the surface, Quillen was betting on something else. He was betting that the earth still held what the wind could not steal. And when the blizzard came, that bet would answer for all of it. So, before this story goes any farther, mark the hole, mark the children, and mark the man they called crazy. If stories of grit, hard-earned wisdom, and frontier survival belong on your screen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Then stay to the end and judge for yourself who truly understood winter. To weigh that fairly, the story has to step back a few months, to when the cold was still only a threat and not yet a verdict. Quillen Voss was 31 years old, living alone on a 140-acre homestead outside Red Hollow, Wyoming territory. He was not known as a talker or a gambler or a man given to grand plans. He worked when work was there, hauled when hauling paid, fixed what broke, and kept mostly to himself. Then, late in the spring, his younger sister died of a lung fever that burned fast and finished clean. It left 3 children behind. Elsie, 10 years old enough to understand loss and resent it. Bram, 8, stubborn enough to hide fear behind hard eyes. June, 5, still small enough to ask where her mother had gone, as if someone could point the way. Quillen buried their mother on the rise above the southern wash, where the ground looked over the open land. When the last shovel of dirt was leveled, he made 2 promises beside that fresh mound. The children would not be split apart and sent house to house, and the land would not be abandoned. Those were noble promises. They were also expensive ones. His shack was not a winter house. It was a shell knocked together from rough lodgepole, stuffed with dry grass, patched with tarred canvas, and smeared with mud where boards failed to meet. In fair weather it passed. In wind it whistled. In hard cold, a bucket of water near the wall would skin over with ice before dawn. He owned 1 old mule, a wagon with a crooked rear axle, and a little over $6 in cash. At the church hall that summer, where men spoke of hay, weather, and what would be needed before frost, Lorne Bellamy said what nearly everyone already knew. A man in Quillen's shape could not cut 22 cords of poor wood before winter closed in. Not while feeding children. Not while hauling water. Not while repairing that shack every time the wind found a new crack. Coal from Laramie Crossing cost more than he could spare. Good lumber cost more still. No one there thought themselves cruel. They believed they were being honest. On that frontier, the old equation was simple. Wood, coal, tight walls, or death. Quillen argued with none of it, because what Bellamy said was mostly true. And what Quillen knew, though he spoke it to no one, was colder still. Even if he did everything they advised, it would not be enough. That was the part no one around him understood. They thought Quillen Voss had chosen the hole because grief had loosened something in his mind. As if a man woke one morning, looked at 3 children in a failing shack, and decided the proper answer was to bury himself alive. But the idea had not come to him whole. It had come in pieces. On the south slope of the homestead, There was a cluster of badger burrows he had seen for years. He noticed them the way a quiet man notices anything that repeats long enough to earn his attention. Most seasons, the dirt around those holes looked dry, loose, ordinary. But that year the fresh spoil was darker, heavier. The kind of earth that seemed to come from farther down than usual. The openings sat low and tight, turned away from the worst of the wind. And by early fall they were already packed and guarded better than he had seen before. That called up something his uncle once said when Quillen was still young enough to think old men only talk to fill silence. When badgers dig deep and close early, the cold that year won't stay near the surface. At the time, it had sounded like one more frontier saying. Later, it sounded different. There was the ice pit behind his shack too. He used it for turnips, salt pork, and rendered lard. In cold weather, it held steady in a way the shack never did. Things inside got cold, yes, but not hard frozen through the middle the way they would above ground. And years earlier, he had stood inside a half-sunk smokehouse west of Red Hollow and felt, with no need of figures, that it gave the wind less to take. Those things had never meant much by themselves. Now they began to lean toward one another. The badger, the buried food, the half-sunk building. The same lesson, spoken three ways. Maybe the ground did not belong entirely to winter. Maybe cold ruled the surface best. And maybe, somewhere below that rule, there was a depth where the wind lost its grip. A thought like that could not be trusted on feeling alone. So Quillen took it where Red Hollow kept the few things that lasted longer than weather, paper, ink, and memory written down. Ada Bell, the schoolmistress, lived in 2 rooms beside the schoolhouse and guarded a shelf of books the way some men guarded rifles. Almanacs, geography texts, old government pamphlets, journals left behind by travelers who had crossed through and never returned. She was not wealthy, but in that country she possessed a rare kind of abundance. Quillen told her what he had noticed. He did not dress it up. He spoke of badgers, buried food, and the feel of air inside half-sunk buildings. Ada listened without smiling. Then she handed him a worn volume with a split spine and plates nearly loose from the binding. Inside were drawings of earth lodges, sod shelters, and dwellings built with walls of ground itself, thick roofs, banked sides. Entrances turned from prevailing wind. Structures meant not to fight weather head-on, but to blunt it, absorb it, outlast it. It gave Quillen no ready-made plan, but it gave names to things he had only sensed. Mass, shelter, thermal hold, windbreak. The ground was not just dirt, it was material. From there he went to Mara Kittredge, a widow who kept chickens, patched tack, and knew enough about soil and timber to distrust both when used badly. He asked to borrow tools. Mara did not laugh. That alone set her apart. Instead, she named dangers one by one. A wall could slump after cold rain. Water could creep under the floor and turn a shelter clammy enough to sicken children. A sod roof could sag under wet snow. Ventilation done wrong could trap smoke or pull every bit of heat straight out. Quillen let her finish. Then he said the only thing that mattered. If he stayed in the shack and worked the usual plan, there was not enough time, not enough strength, and not enough wood. Mara studied him for a long moment. Then she walked to the shed and came back with a mattock, a drain spade, a plumb line, and an old coil of wire. She placed them in his hands. She did not say he was right. She gave him something rarer than approval. She treated him like a man attempting real work. And in Red Hollow, that was no small thing. That might have been enough, in a fairer place. But frontier towns were not built on fairness alone. They were built on weather, shortage, memory, and talk. And talk often moved faster than any storm. Before Quillen struck the first real cut into the ground, Red Hollow had already named the thing, the grave room. It began as a joke. Then it became shorthand. Then it hardened into warning. No one used it more skillfully than Etta Vale, a land-rich widow who measured people the way merchants measured grain by yield, by weakness, by what might be gained, when they could no longer hold their own weight. She understood Quillen's position quickly. If he failed outright, the children would be taken elsewhere, and the homestead would weaken until it could be bought cheap, If he survived barely, the result could be much the same. Either road led toward opportunity. So Etta fed the story carefully. She said grief had turned his mind. She said a man who planned to sleep children under dirt could not be trusted above it. She said no decent person would wait to see what happened. A letter went to the county relief office, another to the church board. Both described 3 young children living under the authority of a man whose judgment had broken. And the dangerous part was not that Etta lied. It was that the lie fit neatly into what people could already see. A quiet, unmarried man. A patched shack. Little money. No woman in the house. No proper winter plan anyone recognized. And now, a room in the earth. Even those who wished Quillen no harm began stepping back from him. At the well, Elsie heard women lower their voices when she approached, then raise them once she passed. In town, Bram heard older boys laugh that he would soon be sleeping like a mole, nose first in the dirt. June did not understand the words, only the tone. Quillen heard enough of it himself. He answered almost none of it. Because there are accusations a man can argue with, and there are others that only time, weather, and survival can answer. He had not yet opened the ground, but the social pit around him had already been dug. So Quillen Voss did the only useful thing left to him. He began. He chose the highest dry shoulder on the south side of the homestead, where runoff would pass below and winter wind struck less directly than it did on the open flats. Then he set stakes, ran line, marked the oval, and drove the first cut into the ground. The top layer went easy, loose soil, light shovel work, fast progress. For a few hours, it almost looked as if stubbornness and muscle might be enough. Then the earth changed. Below the easy layer lay clay mixed with gravel and roots. Heavy stuff. Tight stuff. Each swing of the mattock struck back through the handle like a mule kick. Every shovelful weighed more coming up than it had going down. Quillen built a crude lifting frame from poles and rope. Buckets rose one by one. Bram hauled the line, teeth set hard. Elsie steadied the buckets and dumped spoil clear of the rim. June sat wrapped in a blanket near the grass edge, watching the widening hole the way children watch both danger and wonder at once. The work found its rhythm. Strike, break, shovel, fill, pull, dump, strike again. By the 3rd day, Quillen's hands had swollen and split. Blisters burst under the grip. Blood darkened the wood of the handle. He tore strips from an old shirt, wrapped his palms, and climbed back down. The hole deepened. So did the attention. From the road, people could now see the raw mound of spoil and the shape cut into the land. Wagons slowed. Riders turned heads. Children wandered over in loose packs, bold in the way children become when repeating the courage of adults. They tossed dry clods into the pit. Mole Man! One lump struck Quillen's shoulder. Another shattered against the cut wall. Bram started up the slope in a rage hot enough to forget fear. Quillen caught him by the sleeve and pointed instead to the rope. Pull. That was all. Elsie stood rigid with shame, face burning hotter than the sun. Quillen gave her a bucket to steady. That was all for her, too. He did not chase the mockers. He did not explain himself. He did not ask for fairness. He worked, and that mattered more than progress. Because men with wild notions often talk loud and tire early. But there is a different look to a man who returns to the pit with split hands, day after day, under laughter, under doubt, under the gaze of people waiting to be proven right about his failure. By then, even those who still called him foolish had begun to notice something inconvenient. He was serious, however, was not the same thing as success. About a week into the digging, the weather sent its first reply. A cold rain moved across Red Hollow in the night. Not a grand storm. No thunder. No warning worth naming. Just steady water, driven low and mean by wind, the kind that finds every weak place because it has time. By dawn, Quillen was already at the pit. He climbed down and saw at once what Mara Kittredge had tried to tell him. The north wall had slumped inward where the wet had softened it. Not a collapse large enough to bury a man, but enough to change the shape and weight of the cut. Chunks of heavy mud lay on the floor. Worse still, the ground underfoot held a strange gray dampness. Not pooled water. Not yet. But moisture that had crept in and stayed. That was dangerous in a different way. Cold could be fought with fuel. Damp settled into blankets, lungs, bones. If he kept digging as planned, stubborn and blind, the pit would become a place that stored chill, held rot, and waited for the next wall to fall. Quillen stood in the mud a long moment, looking at the damage. Then he changed the plan. No more depth that day. He cut a drainage trench sloping toward the southern wash. He lined the lowest run with small stones scavenged from the edge of the property. He raised a lip around the future entrance, so runoff would not pour back inside. He recut the north wall at a safer angle, shaving away speed to buy stability. 2 full days were spent on work that made the hole look no deeper than before. 2 days lost. With mornings already growing shorter and sharper, Elsie watched him from the rim, arms folded tight against the wind. "Was Etta right?" she asked at last. "Is this just going to be a wet grave?" Quillen did not rush to comfort her. He looked down at the mud under his boots, then at the trench, carrying a thin ribbon of water away. "If I leave it wet," he said. "Yes." Then he picked up the spade and kept cutting. That mattered, because foolish men mistake the first plan for the only plan. Useful men let failure speak early, while the cost is still bearable. The pit had not won anything, but neither had it beaten him. And somewhere under the rain, under the wasted time, under the sting of doubt, the idea itself had grown stronger. It was no miracle now. It was a problem being worked. And on the frontier, that distinction could change how a man was seen. 2 mornings later, while Quillen was clearing the last of the slumped earth and checking the new drain line, the sound of slow wheels came up the track from the west. Not hurried wheels, not curious wheels, heavy ones, turning under weight. A weathered wagon climbed the rise behind 2 old horses and stopped near the spoil mound. At the reins sat Silas Creed, a gray-bearded loner who dealt with people only when necessity cornered him. He lived beyond Red Hollow in a place most folks described by direction rather than distance. Men traded with him. Few visited him. Fewer knew what he thought of anything. Silas climbed down without greeting. Then he began unloading. Juniper posts. Straight and seasoned. Cottonwood crosspieces. Rawhide lashings. A broad slab of stone. Several lengths of old stovepipe. Rusted but sound enough to use. Quillen stared at the pile before he looked at the man. "I didn't ask you." Silas snorted once, as if talk had already gone too far. 2 years back, he said, my wagon near tipped into the Arroyo Road. You spent half a day getting it upright, Quillen remembered. Silas continued stacking wood beside the pit. You wouldn't take pay. That debt explained the visit only in part. Frontier debts were often forgotten when forgetting was convenient. Silas straightened, looked at Quillen's wrapped hands, then at the dark stains dried into the handles of the tools. A week ago, he said, you had an idea. His eyes moved to the pit. Now you've got blood in the dirt. He nodded once. That's different. It was the closest thing to praise Quillen would ever hear from him. Silas did not claim the pit would work. He did not promise winter could be beaten. He did not offer comfort, blessing, or optimism. He offered materials. And that meant more. Because pity gives scraps. Respect gives weight. Angitati. To posts could carry a roof frame. The crosspieces could span load. The stone might serve a hearth or baffle. The stovepipe could be cut and turned to manage draft. None of it solved the whole problem. But all of it moved the hole one step closer to becoming shelter. Elsie watched from the rim, silent now. Bram ran his hand along the stacked timber, as if touching proof. Quillen said thank you. Silas had already turned back to his wagon. By the time the words were spoken, the old man was climbing to the seat. Some help comes loudly, so everyone can witness it. The kind that matters most often arrives quiet. And for the first time since the digging began, Quillen Voss was no longer standing entirely alone. And once a man is no longer entirely alone, work can change shape. Until then, the pit had been mostly subtraction, Earth removed, walls cut, water chased away. Now it had to become something harder. A place to live. Quillen drove the digging down to 9 feet 6 inches. At that depth, the soil changed again. It darkened, tightened, and held a steadier coolness that felt different from the clammy chill near the surface. This was not weather trapped in dirt. It was ground keeping its own terms. He borrowed Ada Bell's thermometer and checked it morning and evening. Even on mild days, the bottom of the pit held several degrees warmer than the air above. Not enough to boast over, enough to notice, enough to trust. But depth alone would only give them a better hole. He still needed a home. So the next stage began. The juniper posts from Silas Creed went in first, sunk and braced to carry weight. Cottonwood crosspieces spanned the top. Over them, Quillen laid brush mats woven tight enough to catch falling soil. Then came tarred canvas to turn water. Then one layer of sod. Then another. Then packed earth above it all. Each layer answered a threat. Leak, sag, wind, freeze. The entrance was not cut straight down the center. He set it off toward the southeast side, where storms struck less directly, and raised a packed lip around it so runoff would not pour inward. Inside, he built 2 sleeping benches higher than the floor. Cold settles low when it can. Bodies sleep better above what sinks. The fire bowl was not placed in the middle like a parlor stove. It sat slightly off-center beneath the smoke path. Near it, he set the broad stone slab as a baffle, with sections of old stovepipe turned to break a direct draft. Air had to move. Too much, and heat would be stolen. Too little, and smoke would kill them quietly. So Quillen cut a low intake from the sheltered side of the rise. It ran sideways before entering the chamber behind the stone break, forcing the air to slow and turn before meeting the room. Nothing about it looked grand. No carved beams, no painted walls, no proud chimney visible from the road. But each choice had been purchased with an avoided danger. A wet roof, a fallen beam, a smoke-filled night, a frozen floor, a gust that robbed the fire faster than wood could feed it. By the time the last soil was tamped into place, Red Hollow still saw a man burrowing in the ground. What stood there now was something else, not yet proven, but built with reasons. And on the frontier, many things looked clever in daylight and failed by dark. So, when the pit home was finally ready, Quillen treated it less like a triumph than a test. He checked the roof seams once more, cleared the entrance collar, felt the intake path for obstruction. Then he brought the children to the opening. June went first. She clung hard around his neck as he lowered her down the ladder, face buried against his shoulder. But halfway to the chamber floor, she lifted her head. The bite of the upper wind was gone. The air below was cool, yes, but steady. It did not slash at the skin. It simply existed. By the time Quillen's boots touched the floor, her grip had loosened. Bram came next, pretending not to care. Elsie last, trying to look older than 10. Ada Bell had lent them the thermometer. Quillen hung it where no direct draft touched it and waited. Outside that morning, the air sat at 29 degrees. Inside, with no fire burning at all, the chamber held near 46. It was not warm in the soft, indulgent way town parlors imagined warmth. It was warm in the more serious way a body recognizes first. The absence of struggle. No wind stealing through seams. No constant tightening of shoulders. No hands going numb for no reason but exposure. That evening, Quillen built a small fire in the bowl. Not a roaring one. A measured one. After 90 minutes, the thermometer rose to 58. They ate there, spoke little there, waited there. Hours after the flame had dropped to coals and the coals to dull red pockets, Quillen checked again. 51. In the shack above ground, heat fled the moment fuel weakened. It ran through cracks, climbed the roofline, bled into night. Here, the earth had done what he believed it might. It accepted warmth, held it, returned it slowly. Bram tried to hide his surprise and failed. June fell asleep before the second reading. Elsie said nothing at all, but for the first time since the digging began, she took off her coat without being told. No cheers were given. No speech was made. Quillen only studied the thermometer once more, then the walls, then the sleeping children. A man does not celebrate the first bridge simply because it holds one crossing, but he remembers the moment he knows it might. The first true cold arrived a week later. Not a blizzard, not yet, just the opening hand of winter. Morning came with ice crusted around the rim of the water bucket outside. The yard grass stood stiff and silver. Wind crossed the property in long, rough strokes, not sharp enough to terrify, only steady enough to wear things down. That kind of cold kills slowly. It asks for wood every hour. Quillen tested both shelters. In the old shack, a hot stove could raise the air fast within a few feet of the iron. But the moment the fire dropped, warmth thinned and fled. Cold gathered at the walls first, then the floor, then the bed corners. Every crack became a thief. On the same morning, the pit chamber sat at 44 degrees, before any flame was lit. After the evening meal, and a modest fire, it rose again to 56. More important than the numbers was the woodpile. The shack consumed fuel like a hungry animal merely to hold ground. The pit required far less to reach the same livable state. For the first time, Quillen could see a path through winter that did not end in an empty stack and a frozen dawn. Then Lorne Bellamy came to visit. He looked at the thermometer, looked at the fire bowl, looked at the sleeping benches. He did not sneer. He did not apologize either. "Useful," he said at last. From Bellamy, that was nearly generous. Then he added what mattered more. "It ain't deep winter." He tapped one knuckle against the wall. "Ground hasn't locked yet." He spoke of seasons when frost drove farther down than fence posts, of cellars that turned bitter after New Year's, of earth that seemed friendly in November and treacherous in January. "There's a kill zone in this country," he said. "Reach it wrong, and the ground quits helping, starts taking." He climbed back out without another word. Quillen did not dismiss him, because Bellamy was no fool. He was a man educated by losses. That night, the pit still held warm air. The children still slept better below than above. Yet something new had entered the room. Not cold. Doubt with evidence behind it. The shelter had beaten the shack. It had not yet beaten winter itself. So Quillen stopped treating success as a feeling and began treating it as a record. Each day he noted the morning temperature, wind direction, how long warmth held after supper, how much wood had been burned, how damp the bedding felt, how quickly the fire drew. Numbers did not flatter. They warned. And in the middle of those useful figures, he noticed something that chilled him more than any outside gust. On early mornings, the north wall felt different. Not wet, not drafty, cold. A narrow band at first, high along the shoulder of the wall. The kind of cold that seemed to live inside the earth itself, not in the air. Quillen pressed his palm there, then lower again over the next days. The line was descending. He drove small charcoal pegs into the wall to mark its height. Every few mornings, he moved them down a little farther. One corner of the floor turned hard as fired clay before sunrise. Bellamy's warning returned in full. There was a depth, or a season, where soil ceased to lend warmth and began to draw it away. If that cold zone reached the sleeping benches, bodies would feed heat into the ground through the night. Elsie noticed the change in him before she understood the cause. "Should we go back to the shack?" she asked one evening. "At least it looks like a house." Quillen had no clean answer ready. The shack looked like safety. The pit had behaved like it. Those were not always the same thing. So he said little. Measured more. Watched the wall. Counted wood. Waited. Above them, winter was still gathering strength. Below them, even the earth seemed to be reconsidering its loyalty. Then came a day that made nearly everyone else believe winter had reconsidered too. Late in December, the air softened without warning. Snow along the fence rails sagged as if thinking of melt. The sky lost its iron look. Wind dropped away. Doors opened, voices carried farther. At the church hall, word spread of dry goods being handed out and a prayer gathering before year's end. Families hitched teams and went gladly, relieved to feel the season step back for once. Elsie wanted to go more than she wanted flour. After weeks below ground, a few hours among other people, in light, on open boards, felt to her like being human again. She begged hard enough to forget pride. Quillen said nothing at first. He climbed the south rise alone and looked over the property. The badger burrows were still sealed. No fresh scratchings, no loosened dirt, no sign of movement. He watched the windsock tide near the shed. It had turned direction too quickly, too cleanly. The calm did not feel earned. It felt borrowed. The kind of stillness that comes before something larger claims it back. When he returned, he said the children were staying. Elsie stared at him as if struck. "You want us hidden down there forever," she said, like something shameful. He let the words land where they would, because this was the cruelest kind of choice. One made without proof that could be shown to a child. If he was wrong, he was keeping them from food, warmth, company, and one decent memory. If he was right, a few pleasant hours above ground might cost more than they could ever repay. Bram said nothing. June sensed only the tension and moved closer to the ladder. Wagons rolled past toward town, laughter carried in the mild air. Quillen watched them go, then looked once more toward the sealed holes on the hillside. The sky was offering comfort. The ground was not, and he chose which one to trust. By early afternoon, the answer rose on the northwest horizon. It was not a cloud. It looked like someone lowering a dark wall onto the edge of the world. Quillen saw it once and wasted no second look. "Down," he said. The pace changed at once. Bram to the ladder. June into Elsie's arms. Blankets first. Water bucket next. Lantern hooked low. Kindling dry. Door cover clear. Move. Move now. He sent the children below, checked the entrance collar, then built only a modest fire in the bowl. Not comfort fire. Survival fire. Enough heat to hold the chamber. No waste. "Keep the dry blankets near you," he told Bram. "Water where hands can find it." Then the wind struck. Not gradually. Not with warning. It hit the grassland like a dropped weight. The first blast shook loose dust from the roof timbers. The second drove ice grains against the entrance boards hard enough to sound like thrown sand. In minutes, the air outside began to plunge. Quillen sealed the hatch and came down the ladder. Above them, the noise changed from weather into violence. A long, tearing scrape. Then another. Then a constant raking roar, as if the whole plane were being dragged across the roof. Elsie pulled June close. Bram gripped the bucket handle with white knuckles. Quillen placed one hand against the north wall. The cold was there. He could feel it pressing through the earth in a slow, immense way. But it had not yet entered the room itself. The air around the children remained steady. The small fire breathed low and controlled. Outside, every cabin standing proud in open wind had entered the same examination. Loose seams, thin walls, hungry stoves, poor wood, bad doors, drafted corners. No speech could help them now. No argument. No laughter from town. No old certainty. Only materials, design, fuel, and luck. The blizzard had finally stepped into the story as more than threat or rumor. It had come as judge, and like all true judges of the frontier, it offered no explanation, no mercy, and no appeal. Somewhere in that roaring dark, a new sound broke through. 3 hard blows on the entrance cover, then 2 weaker ones. Not timber, not branches, not wind-thrown debris. Hands. Quillen was already moving. He climbed the ladder, braced one shoulder against the hatch, and cracked it open only as wide as a man could force without letting the storm take the whole lid. White air lunged inward. With it came a body. He caught the coat first, then the man inside it, and dragged him down as the hatch slammed shut again. It was Oren Vale, Etta Vale's nephew. The same family that had helped name this place a grave room had now crawled to it to avoid becoming one. Oren's face was stippled with frost. His lips were blue. His eyelashes held ice. Both hands were stiff and nearly useless, fingers curled halfway shut. He shook so hard it seemed his bones were trying to break free of him. Quillen wasted no breath on irony. Bram, kettle. Elsie, blankets. He cut away the frozen outer coat where it would not peel clean. Set Orin near the fire, but not too near. Too much heat too fast can injure as surely as cold. He gave him warm water and slow swallows. Wrapped him. Rubbed life back into the forearms before touching the hands. The thermometer on the wall held between 45 and 49 degrees. Outside, the cold had fallen into the range that steals fingers, eyes, and judgment in short order. Inside, the chamber stayed survivable. Orin's teeth rattled against the tin cup. June stared at him with round, silent eyes. Bram fed the fire, exactly as instructed. Elsie tucked another blanket around the man whose kin had shamed them in town. That mattered too, because shelter changes the people inside it, if it is worth the name. After a long while, Orin's shaking eased enough for speech. He looked around the chamber, at the packed walls, at the low, steady fire, at the children alive and warm beneath the earth. Then he asked the same thing June had once asked on the first night. "How is it warm in here?" No one answered at once. The room itself had already done so. This was no theory now, no wounded pride, no odd scheme waiting to fail. The pit had kept Quillen alive. It had kept the children alive. And now it had saved a witness from the other side. From that moment on, Red Hollow might still resent Quillen Voss. But it could no longer honestly dismiss him. When the blizzard finally spent itself, the silence that followed was not gentle. Quillen lifted the hatch and climbed into a world scraped clean of its former shape. Fences were buried to their top rails. Wagons lay half-swallowed in drifts. Rooflines had changed angles under snow load. The air itself felt emptied, as if sound had frozen and shattered in the night. He left Bram to tend the fire and started toward the church hall. The tracks of those who had gone there the day before were gone entirely. He found them by accident, and then by pattern. Here, a glove. There, a broken sled runner. Farther on, a dark form against white ground. Some had tried to turn back in the whiteout and lost direction within yards. Others had stayed too long, trusting walls that leaked heat faster than fuel could replace it. Near a drifted ditch, he found Ada Bell among a small cluster who had tried to guide children home. She was beyond help. A few feet away, one boy still breathed in thin, stubborn pulls. Quillen carried him back to the pit. The child lived. That was frontier arithmetic in its rawest form. Loss beside rescue. Grief beside usefulness. No clean victories. By afternoon, Red Hollow had begun counting. People lost. Stock dead. Hands frostbitten. Cabins that had held a stove, but not enough warmth. Wood piles gone to ash. Doors blown inward. Men who had mocked drafts now speaking of them with respect. A few days later, Lorne Bellamy came to Quillen's place again. He descended the ladder slowly, touched the packed wall with one hand, studied the intake path, the offset fire bowl, the raised benches, the entrance collar. He asked the lowest temperature held inside, asked how much wood had been burned through the storm. Quillen answered plainly. Bellamy listened, then stood quiet for longer than usual. "When I said there was a kill zone," he finally muttered, "I thought you dug into it." He looked once around the chamber. Turns out you dug below it. That was his apology. It was enough. Later, Mara Kittredge came and made the same inspection in her own way. She checked roof sag, drainage, smoke draw, wall firmness. Then she nodded. "You didn't beat winter," she said. "You stepped out of where it strikes hardest." That was closer to the truth than any praise. And Orin Vale, with healing hands wrapped in cloth, told anyone who would listen where he would have died had the pit not been there. After that, Eda Vale found fewer ears willing to hear the old grave room story. By the next autumn, 9 homesteads around Red Hollow had dug some version of earth sheltering into their land. Some were crude, some clever, some failed and were improved. Most borrowed Quillen's principles. Turn the entrance, raise the sleepers, slow the draft, shed the water, use depth wisely. He charged no fee, sold no plans, claimed no title. When asked, He showed men where he had been wrong first. That may have been the most valuable lesson of all. Years later, people remembered the storm by snowfall totals, by livestock numbers, by names carved into cedar markers. But beneath those memories, another truth endured. When the wind came to take everything thin and proud above ground, Quillen Voss trusted what the earth could still hold. Because of that, 3 children slept through the coldest night of that winter and did not become names on wood. If you had stood in Red Hollow that winter, would you have called Quillen Voss crazy for digging that pit home or wise before everyone else saw it? Let us know in the comments.